The prize committee itself is composed of faculty members that we select every year. It's actually, there's a lot of faculty who like being on the Kappa prize committee for obvious reasons. You're reading truly excellent work. And so they're constantly asking me on it. It's about the only case I know that faculty members like committee work at all. So this year the prize committee was Vinnie Ferraro in International Relations, Amy Martin in English, Rachel Fink in Biology, and then I was on it too. And we sorted through all the entries, and we have come up with co-winners of this year's prize. And as Stan mentioned, we'll invite each of them up in turn to talk about their work. The first winner was Huda Alawa. Her thesis was on Identity Danish Modern, Trampoline House, and the prototyping of an inclusive Denmark. Huda, congratulations.
Thank you, Professor Hartley, for the introduction, and thank you all for taking time to come out here today. When I first started brainstorming what I'd cover for this talk, I was stumped. Granted, part of the issue was that the brainstorming was happening 8 hours before I'm supposed to stand here. But the bigger problem was I wasn't sure how much I could fit in on a 135-page thesis in 5 to 10 minutes. So since that's really quite impossible, this is just a short glimpse of why I got interested in the work that I did and a short understanding of what it was that I accomplished. So before I start, I just want to give you a brief introduction on who I am as a person. So this might not always be normal for these types of speeches, but it'll make sense when I talk about my thesis. I'm Danish and Syrian, born in Japan, but spent most of my life growing in American suburbs, where my family was a token diversity. It was confusing, to say the least. I found myself grappling with my identity, figuring out where I would fit in, even as I lived in a nation that prided itself on plurality and diversity. That constant crisis leaked into my questions and conversations with my mother. See, here's the thing. My mother is a proud Dane, who was excluded from Danish society by a simple decision she made when she was 16 years old. Born and raised in Denmark, my mother was brought up in a secular, non-religious setting. When she reached teenagehood, however, she converted to Islam and began to wear the hijab, the Islamic headscarf. Though previously she had been one of the Danes, her headscarf immediately marked her as other, and her community quickly began treating her differently, going so far as to speak to her in English despite knowing that she was born and raised in Denmark. It was dehumanizing, isolating, and it sparked my thesis research. How was it, I wondered, that Danish national identity works to exclude certain individuals from Danish society? And how, if at all, is this exclusion contested? I first heard about Trampoline House in passing and was excited. What type of house is full of trampolines? Unfortunately for the child within me, Trampoline House was not a place of trampolines that I had hoped for. It was, however, the place that I would end up doing my fieldwork in. When I first stepped into Trampoline House, I was captivated. The flavorful scent of spicy food lingered in the air, reminding me of my Syrian grandmother's home-cooked meals. Members sprawled around the house, laughing and loudly engaged in conversation, paying little to no attention to me. That was rare for me in Denmark, where I was used to the condescending looks I would get on the streets in Copenhagen. But when I entered the house, nobody batted an eye. That's when I knew that Trampoline House was not like the rest of Denmark. Trampoline House sees itself as a member-driven culture house, bringing together immigrant users and other residents of Denmark to model a more inclusive Danish society. Basically, it's everything Denmark isn't. Normally, Danish identity is exclusive, playing out in everyday life through activities such as bike riding or speaking the Danish language. Immigrants, especially non-Western immigrants, are perceived in politics as threats to Danish values, unfamiliar with Danishness, and therefore unable to be included. At the house, however, these barriers are broken down. One volunteer that I spoke to at the house, a Dane named Louise, constantly compared herself to the other Danes found in everyday Danish society. As she described it, other Danes are all the same. They all wear tight, high-waisted pants, their leather jackets, and their ponytails with a little bit of loose hair. They're stuck in one culture. Unlike these other Danes, this one volunteer, Louise, saw herself as part of something bigger at the Trampoline House, where diversity is welcome and even something to be proud of. Rather than seeing different cultures as threats, Trampoline House fights this by performing as a place of meeting people who act, think, and even dress differently. There's no one way of being Danish at the house. As long as you're a person, you're welcome. So, as a member in the house, it's common to find yourself in a lot of very confusing conversations because there's so many different members from so many diverse backgrounds, both ethnically and linguistically. As a result, there's no one way to speak at the house. So, even though they say that there's this idea of a trampoline house English, it takes very much time and effort to accomplish this one way of speaking. And I experienced this myself. 1 week into my fieldwork, I decided to attend a Friday dinner, which was one of the bigger social events at the house. I was motivated by my research, but obviously also the fact that there was food there was a good plus. So I sat at a table surrounded by volunteers on one side, all of whom spoke English, and Arabic-speaking immigrant users on the other. I was scared to embarrass myself with my barely passable Arabic, so I was really mostly talking to the volunteers in English. Halfway through, a couple of the immigrant users teased me, speaking to me in broken English to tell me that I was ignoring them on purpose. Of course, at this point, I did what any person in my situation would do. I made a complete fool of myself speaking Arabic by stumbling across the words as hard as I could. Quickly, the immigrant users picked up on my slack, helping me translate between the words based on my hand gestures, or even by helping switch between languages based on their own linguistic abilities. So while I had been having a good time talking to the volunteers in English at first, what I hadn't realized was that I was being completely rude because I was going against one of the main principles of Trampoline House, which was that of inclusion. The experience humbled me, and it made me realize how much even I myself have to learn about acceptance and inclusion. And that's something that I was able to develop even throughout the house. This past February, I came across an article from a major Danish news site that talked about how 70% of Danes have little to no contact with immigrants and are completely disinterested in bridging that gap. That means that for every 10 people sitting in this room right now, 7 of you are completely okay with never having met someone who is an immigrant. To us, a nation of immigrants, that's terrifying. But to Denmark, that's a reality. Trampoline House wants to turn this idea on its head. The first day I walked into Trampoline House, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The house was a world that I was unused to, and yet it was something I felt at ease with all at once. Trampoline House to me is more than just a simple thesis. For me, it's everything I wished my mother had growing up. It signifies a bright future for an inclusive Denmark, one where immigrants are part of Danish society, accepted by Danes who might not always understand their differences. The short work that I did at the house gave me a glimpse of a world where being a Dane does not equal homogeny. Until that day, however, there's still much work to be done. Thank you so much.
The second of the co-winners of the Phi Beta Kappa Prize for this year is Hannah Honstein-Flack. Congratulations.